السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا، من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له، ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، ونشهد أن سيدنا مولانا محمدا عبده ورسوله. أما بعد، قال الله تبارك وتعالى: يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا. Respected honorable elders, brothers, sisters, in the last two khutbahs we had been discussing or mentioning the issues in relation to women or girls, how they are perceived, their challenges. In the last khutbah we mentioned what rank Islam gives a woman. If she is a daughter, if she is a wife, or she is a mother, what rank and what status Islam gives them. In a nutshell, the mother, as the narration says, paradise lies beneath her feet. If there's anyone after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger, then it's going to be the parents, and from amongst the parents it's the mother who is to be given the highest form of respect. The highest form of respect, which the Prophet ﷺ emphasized 3 times over that of the father. So from there we can see the status that Islam gives to a woman who is a mother. In respect to a wife, then the very fact that your character is judged on the basis of how you treat them shows that Islam gives them that status, which if you do not recognize or treat them with that respect and according to their status, then your character in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is deficient. When it comes to the daughter, then the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam has mentioned that person who is given a daughter, tested through her, and he bears patiently and brings her up, then that daughter is that father's ticket to paradise. The daughters are mercies from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through whom you can earn your paradise. So just looking at women from this angle itself, we can see the status Islam has given them. But I made mention that why do then women still feel as though they have been treated inferior? Why do they still feel as though they are oppressed? And often they blame Islam for this. Then the answer to that is because of how we treat them, not how Islam treats them. And the reason why we treat them in the way we do will differ from culture to culture. So there's a role which the culture plays. There was a culture of Jahiliyyah, pre-Islam, where they despised having a daughter. إذا بشر أحدهم بالأنثى ظل وجهه مسودا وهو كظيم يتوارى من القوم من سوء ما بشر به أيمسكه على هون أم يدسه في التراب ألا ساء ما يحكمون. Allah criticizes this very idea that when you are given the news of a daughter, then Allah describes the person's face. it darkens. He's depressed. He's unhappy that a daughter has been born to him. And he's thinking to himself, how am I going to hide from my people because of this shame? Am I going to keep this daughter of mine and live in humiliation because I have a daughter? Or shall I bury her in the ground? Although that was in Jahiliyyah, we find that very concept in our culture as well, where the first child is expected that it should be a boy. And if it isn't, oh, it's a girl. Alright, when are you going to have a boy? And there is, maybe not verbal, but definitely there's a feeling of displeasure when a person only has daughters and no sons. It's like, oh, you don't have a son. As though that only by having a son, that is a sign of some privilege and an endowment, a gift from Allah, whereas a girl isn't. Whereas clearly it has been mentioned that girls are rahmah from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that is there still prevalent in our culture, or in many cultures. Then we find what the daughters can do, and in comparison to what the sons can do. So take one example as education. Now I'm talking about culture here. Take it the Indo subculture, the subcontinent culture. Or not too familiar with the African culture, but there will definitely be a common treatment of women amongst all the cultures. So when it comes to education, yes, they're given some sort of education. But then it comes to a point, oh, you don't need a higher education than this. That's for men to go into. For you, you have to learn how to cook and keep the house and get married. So again, because it's so prevalent, not just in one culture, but across the cultures, and it so happens that whether it's a religious family or non-religious, non-practicing family, it's the same. Sometimes it's taken to be that this is from Islam, because the religious people are also doing this. The religious families are also doing this. Coupled with the lack of Islamic education of the girls, they only grow up to see whatever happens around them to be maybe Islamic. This is what Islam says, and that's why we have to just carry on with this. Take the example of time of marriage. Does the girl have a choice to marry who she wants? Does she have a say? Does she have a choice to say, no, I do not want to get married to this person? Culture influences this. In some cultures, the girls have no choice at all. It's actually immodest of a girl in those cultures to say, I don't want to get married to so-and-so, but I would rather get married to someone else. Or say, I would like to get married to such a person. It's actually considered to be immodest. Again, when they don't have the knowledge of what Islam says, then they perceive this restriction, or this, if you want to call it, forced marriage to be from Islam. And again, they start hating Islam for this. It happens in non-practicing families, and it also happens in practicing families. Hence, they begin to think that this is what Islam says. Divorce. A woman is divorced. Or the whole question of, can she ask for a divorce? It is something which Islam itself looks down upon, the entire concept of a divorce. It is the most hated thing of the halal things in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's the most hated thing from amongst the halal things. But it's been made in such a thing that a person has to persevere through all sorts of tortures and abuses, just because in society or in that culture, if you get divorced, it brings shame to the entire family or tribe. So a girl is forced to stay through many abuses, forms of abuses, just for that reason. Now, again, that sometimes is taken to be that that's what Islam says you must do. Whereas clearly we find from the Sahaba, from the Hadith, there are clear instructions when divorces can be asked for from the women itself. Widows, husband passes away, whether she is young or old, there is no concept of them being married off again. It's almost as though after they passed their iddah period, the waiting period, if they do choose to marry again or they're asked to marry again, it's almost as though they are disloyal to their first husband. It's almost as though all they are worried about is their desires. And hence they have to remain a widow, unmarried, for the rest of their lives. That actually stems from different areas where we come from. In the Hindu culture, it was such. Where husband dies, the woman will be buried with the husband, cremated with the husband. That was in the original Hindu law. And because we come from such areas, although we may not practice on the same, there's an element of understanding that yes, after the husband dies, the woman, it's not actually good for them to marry. Again, because we come from the subcontinent, there's an influence of Hindu culture or Hindu concepts with the Muslims adopted. And that was in terms of inheritance. Inheritance wasn't given in the culture to women, to girls, to wives, to daughters. Instead, the husband's brothers will take it, or their grandparents will take it, and they'll distribute amongst the male members, with nothing given to the women. This was again in Jahiliyyah. And this is prevalent in our culture too, until today exists. In fact, it isn't just in our Indo-Pak culture, but in the West, it was actually worse. And they only got their rights much later. In the 1900s, they got inheritance laws. In the 1700s, if a man was unhappy with his marriage and he didn't have the money to divorce, they would actually put her into like some sort of shackle from her neck to her wrist to her legs or to her waist, and they'll parade her around and auction her and sell her off. This is in the West, in the 1700s. So across the different cultures, much long after the Prophet ﷺ gave us these beautiful teachings, all of these forms of Jahiliyyah still existed. And depending on where the Muslims were residing, it seems as though they adopted the cultures of those areas. And because of their ignorance of what Islam says, if there was anything which conformed a bit to Islamic principles, they stuck to those cultures and thought that was Islamic too. Again, another example. At the time of marriage, to see for the groom and the bride to see each other and to speak to one another. In Islam is there, the Prophet ﷺ told the Sahabi, go and see, if you haven't seen the women, go and see them. And the person gave a reason because the Ansari women had something about them in their eyes. And it wasn't probably something which everyone would like. So the Prophet ﷺ advised, go and see her. So that's established in the Sunnah. But the culture, because of the hijab principles, they took that to the extreme whereby even at the time of marriage they would not. It's actually taken to be more than haram for them, for the girl and the boy to actually see each other. So again, with the absence of Islamic knowledge and Islamic learning, they will only see that this is what Islam says, as opposed to this being culture. Working. Again, in our Indo-Pak culture, especially those from the rural areas, is something which women don't go into, whatever profession. Their job is to be a housewife and nothing more. In contrast to that, in the West, because we're living here now, and we've come from those areas, and we're residing here, now our younger generation have been exposed to a different culture other than the one we have come from. So yes, the elder generation might still be holding on to certain practices and customs which they've grown up with, which they had to go through. And often they will say, look, this is how we got married, this is how you are going to get married. This is how it's always been within our family, so you can't change that. Not understanding that this younger generation has not grown up in that culture, so they haven't seen it, so they don't value it either. What they have seen is what happens in the West. And now, because everything that is happening in the West is actually conforming either to the desires, or it's conforming to actually what should be in Islam as well. So therefore they see actually it's the West giving us these rights, and Islam is what we see from our culture. So they develop a liking for the Western ways in opposition of Islamic ways, whereas it wasn't the Islamic ways they were opposing, they were actually opposing the cultures. So this younger generation, not having the knowledge of Islam, everything which is from the customs and cultures, they perceive it to be Islam, and then they build up a disliking or a hatred for Islam itself. And that's when they begin to say, oh, Islam is a misogynistic religion. It's something which favors men over women, where women are seen as inferior. And of course, with the propaganda, on top of all of this, it only influences their minds all the more. What is the reality then? Now, when we look at, these were just some of the issues. Just on the topic, since this come to mind, on the topic of marriage, and especially this usually kicks off, arguments begin, and there's a breakup in the family when it comes to the point of marriage. Other than that, I think all families have adapted to sending their girls off for education now, especially here, without any restrictions, which is on the other extreme now. From one extreme of no education to education being everything with no restriction of hijab, free mixing, going out, living on their own amongst strangers with no restrictions. Now they've been let to go anywhere they want to study. Foreign land, off you go. Your study is more important. So now they're just living on their own. They're going about their lives. They're making their own choices for their of their careers. But it comes to the point of marriage now, and again, this same question or this same issue arises. No, you have to get married to whom we say, because we know better, we mean the best for you, we know who will be the best husband for you. Whereas the girl says, no, I want to marry so and so. Is that something wrong from the perspective of a girl to say, I want to get married to such and such person? Or to have a kind of a description of who they want to get married to? No, it isn't. Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anh proposed to Kulthum bint Abi Bakr, the daughter of Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, via Aisha radiallahu anh. Umar radiallahu anh was at this time the Amir al-Mu'mineen. Kulthum was a young girl. When Aisha radiallahu anh came to her and gave the proposal, saying, this is Amir al-Mu'mineen. Now Umar radiallahu anh wasn't, Umar radiallahu anh was Umar radiallahu anh. He was a warrior like none other. But Kulthum turned around and said, تزوجيني عمر? Are you getting me married to Umar? وَقَدْ عَرَفْتَ غَيْرَتَهُ وَخَشُونَةَ عَيْشِهِ. You know of what kind of jealousy he possesses and what kind of a hard living he has. Umar was an ascetic. Although being Amir al-Mu'mineen, he led a hard and harsh life. So she said, إِنَّمَا أُرِيدُ فَتًى مِّن قُرَيْشٍ. I want a young man from the Quraysh. يَصُبُّ عَلَيَّ الدُّنْيَا صَبًّا. Someone who's going to pour out the world on top of me. That's who I want. This was the daughter of Abu Bakr radiallahu anha, sister of Aisha radiallahu anha, saying this to al-Mu'minin Aisha radiallahu anha. But there wasn't like, oh my God, what kind of person are you? What kind of a daughter are you? What kind of a sister are you? There was nothing. She understood. She said, okay, fine, let me manage the situation. Told Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anh, you go speak to Umar radiallahu anh. And just mention in a good way, in a way where he's not going to get upset. And that was it. Marriage wasn't an issue. In fact, they got married on the battlefield. They got married on the battlefield, consummated the marriage on the battlefield, and still carried on. There wasn't no, oh my God, they're in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How can they even think of such a thing? It wasn't there. In fact, a lot of the Sahabiyat, they had their own professions. Layla bint Abdullah, also known as Ash-Shifa. She was a doctor. The Prophet ﷺ went to her and said, teach Hafsa, took Hafsa radiallahu anha, the daughter of Umar and also the wife of the Prophet ﷺ, and said that teach Hafsa the ruqya, the cure for ant bites, just as you have taught her how to write. So she wasn't just a doctor, she was a literacy teacher too. She taught the Sahabiyat how to write. And she also was a doctor and she taught how to cure certain illnesses. Another lady, another Sahabiya, Rufayda al-Aslamiyya. She had the first hospital in Medina. She had the first military mobile hospital on the battlefields. She would put up a tent. She would have her equipments of all what she needed in order to treat the wounded. And the other Sahabiyat, Nusayba radiallahu anha, Nusayba bint Ka'b. These were all first aiders who would be with her on the battlefield, tending to the wounded, bringing them into the tents and giving them their treatment. There was Sulaym. This is an interesting one for the women. She was a makeup artist. Makeup artist is in our language. But in those days, they were known to be experienced in makeup. Salma radiallahu anha, known to take good care of her hair and to put on makeup too. She said she had freckles. She used to put this thing called wars on the freckles. And she used to get aloe vera, put it on her eyes to make her face glow. Something which women can relate to. But this was the Sahabiyat. Yes, they made those sacrifices which they made. They were on that level of piety that they were on. But they led these normal lives also. They had the same desires and likings which women have today and girls have today. But just because of these desires and the liking to put makeup on and to dress up, they were not looked down upon as immodest or not being pious. It was Islam that inspired them to go into all of these different roles. And again, this was as a grown-up, Hafsa radhiyallahu was being taken to learn. So it wasn't as if, it was just for the young girls and it came to age where they got married off and that's it. So when we look deeper into the seerah and the Sahabiyat, we will find a very good example of how we should be with our women, our daughters, and our wives also. And this will dispel a lot of things, a lot of myths, and a lot of misconceptions in regard to Islam and women. May Allah Ta'ala give us understanding. Ameen.